Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the people's channel and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Very good evening to you. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. The government's under pressure to reveal the exact number of schools at risk of collapse due to crumbling concrete. Labour is planning to force a vote to compel the Prime Minister to publish a list of all schools at risk, with more than 100 told to fully or partially close just days before the new term begins. Experts are warning the problem is being complicated by the coexistence of asbestos in schools and other public buildings. The Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, says the government should have acted sooner.
Appreciate that lots of parents across the country will be concerned because, sadly many children are not going to be able to return to education or will be moved into porta cabins or alternative accommodation because of the risk that this kind of crumbly concrete is going to pose. It all feels very last minute, and what we're calling on the government to do is to publish a full list of all of the schools affected so that parents can be confident about where the problems are, and if they're not prepared to do that, we'll force a vote in Parliament this week to make it happen.
The number of people crossing the Channel in small boats has hit a new daily record for this year. 872 migrants in 15 dinghies were intercepted yesterday. At least another 2 small boats have made it to UK waters today. GB News can reveal the total number of people entering the country illegally has now passed 21,000 so far this year. The Chancellor has renewed his pledge to half inflation, saying it's time to see the job through. Speaking ahead of the next Bank of England announcement on the 21st of this month, Jeremy Hunt insisted the government is on track to reach the target this year. Labour's accusing him of being completely out of touch with the realities faced by families across the country. It comes as the latest figures show the UK economy recovered from the pandemic faster than expected. Tesco staff are to be offered body cams after a significant rise in violent attacks. The Chief Executive, Ken Murphy, says he's been forced to increase security measures after seeing physical assaults rise by a third since last year. Writing in the Mail on Sunday, he's called for tougher laws to make abuse or violence towards retail workers an offence, resulting in longer sentences. A red weather alert's been issued for parts of Spain as storms sweep across the country. Residents in Alcanar on the east coast, just south of Barcelona, have been told to stay inside as water floods the streets. In the capital, Madrid's mayor has advised the same, with torrential rain forecast over the next 12 hours. And the public will be consulted on plans for a permanent memorial to the late Queen nearly a year after her death. Organised by an independent committee, the tribute will consider Queen Elizabeth's life of public service and the causes she supported. It will also include a national legacy programme and will be unveiled in 2026 on what would have been her 100th birthday. And this is GB News on TV, on digital radio and on your smart speaker too. Now, it's time for Camilla.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm back. That's what the auto cue says. I have to announce it with jazz hands. Although I am delighted to be back because I do love this show and I did miss it over the last 2 weeks. So thank you to Tom Harwood for holding the fort so admirably as ever. So I'm hoping that we do have on the line Treasury Minister Gareth Davies, who I think is joining me remotely. Gareth, are you there? Can you hear me? Hello, Mr Davies. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Thank you for bringing your interview a little bit forward so we could chat to you about the economic picture. Look, you must be delighted by these ONS figures, giving a much more positive view of the British economy. But of course, the inevitable question is going to be asked, why don't you cut taxes then?
Well, great to be with you and thanks for having me on. I think you're right. This is really positive news that the ONS have uplifted the figures for GDP, showing that the UK grew faster out of the pandemic than any country in Europe. Obviously, this is a revision and we welcome that, but we're focused on the future. And that's why we're bearing down on inflation, we're investing in our economy and ensuring that we can stimulate more business investment. We are very clear that the #1 priority, as I say, is bearing down on inflation because that's the biggest tax that we can cut. It affects every single person in this country, every business, everybody's struggling with it. We've got to tackle that first. And of course, we want to bring down taxes eventually, but it doesn't come, before sound money.
But isn't it a major problem for a Tory government that the taxpayer doesn't think they're getting good value for money, with they're being burdened with the highest taxes since the Second World War, and at the same time we've got polling carried out by Lord Ashcroft, who's obviously got links to the Conservative Party, in the Mail on Sunday, and when asked whether they think public services have declined in the last decade, so that's completely under Tory rule, 75% say yes. That's a damning indictment of conservatism, isn't it, over the past decade?
Well, I think the figures show that public services have performed well. I think we all remember the service that the NHS provided us through the pandemic. It was second to none. Education standards have increased significantly since 2010. And on taxes, we've brought about 3 million people out of tax altogether by increasing the thresholds. We still have the lowest corporation tax in the G7, and we've got one of the most generous tax allowances, corporate tax allowances in the OECD. So it's on us, actually, Camilla, to go on shows like this and communicate what we've done, the success that we've achieved.
But let's communicate honestly, please, Minister, because at the same time we've got 7.5 people on NHS waiting lists. We've got a National Audit Office report which has found that 700,000 school pupils may be learning in a building that is crumbling. So it's not going particularly well. What are you going to do about these crumbling schools? Why won't you produce a comprehensive list so that parents can know whether their children are studying in a safe environment and that the roof isn't going to cave in on them?
Well, protecting children and staff in schools is obviously a paramount priority, and that's why the Education Secretary has acted so swiftly on new evidence that has emerged during the summer and as recent as last week. We have been very proactively engaged on this for the past few years. Every one of the 22,500 schools has been surveyed and sent questionnaires to determine where RAC exists. That has determined that 156 schools out of the 22,500 have confirmed RAC. 52 of those action has already been taken and mitigation has already been actioned. 104, we've now decided that we advise the bodies responsible for those institutions to vacate while mitigations can take place. So obviously this is incredibly serious, it's very concerning, but most people in this country will not be affected by this. Parents will be told by their schools first and foremost whether they're impacted. If parents watching this have not heard from their schools by the opening of schools, they should proceed to the school as normal. That's been our priority. The Education Secretary will be making a statement, though, later this week in the House of Commons.
And yet we hear from an investigation by Schools Week that the government knew that this was a problem back in 2018. So why have you been so late to act? Why are we now in a situation where parents are not able to send their children into school this week because their classrooms aren't safe?
Well, like I said, the vast majority of schools will not be impacted. Even where they have confirmed cases of RAC, it is unlikely that schools will have to close, although inevitably some will. This could be as small as a one room, by the way. It could be a boiler room in an outbuilding. We're taking it on a case-by-case building. So it's not the case that all face-to-face lessons will be cancelled. That's not the case, and we're providing financial support to ensure that mitigations are in place. In terms of when we knew what, this is obviously material that was installed in the 1960s and 80s, and from the 1990s, successive governments have known about the risk and have managed those risks. In that time, experts have evolved their advice. In 2018, we issued guidance to schools to say that they should have contingency measures in place for short notice vacation if they have RAC. In 2022, we surveyed 22,500 schools to determine where that RAC was, and we've acted on that immediately. This is in contrast, by the way, to most countries around the world, but including Labour-run Wales, who have failed to do this. They've failed to survey their schools to determine where RAC exists, and so they're going to have to catch up very quickly with what we've been doing in England, and that's a really important point to make.
Well, having said that, Mr Davies, why then, if you're so well prepared and you're ahead of this curve, are you announcing this 2 days before school start? What on earth do you expect parents to do with regard to childcare? And equally, wouldn't you be quite worried with the kind of opaqueness around this list, this mystical list that the government seems unlikely to ever publish? If you've got children at a state school, and there's now also talk, by the way, about an asbestos problem. We've got another story in the Mail on Sunday about a hospital in Cambridgeshire which is having to prop up the ceiling. You'd be worried sending infants into that environment, wouldn't you?
Of course, as a parent, you want to know that your children are safe. And as I say, the vast majority of schools will not be impacted by this. Those that are impacted, it will likely not lead to the school being closed. There will be mitigations in place to maintain face-to-face lessons. In terms of why now, obviously, you know, a few days before the opening of term, that is not something we would have chosen. This is based on very new advice as late as last week, where previously determined non-critical, in the words of a surveyor, non-critical RAC existence has failed. And on that basis, we changed the advice to those bodies that are responsible, local authorities and academy trusts who are responsible for building maintenance. Our advice changed out of an abundance of caution, because children are involved, to say, you know what, let's vacate any case where RAC exists so that we can get the surveyors in, determine how safe they are, have a case-by-case risk assessment. Most will not be impacted at all in this country, but it is absolutely right that we do this, as inconvenient as it is. And by the way, if this happened during term time, we would make exactly the same decision. So it is incredibly inconvenient, but hopefully parents can understand that while most are not impacted, those that are, it is inconvenient, but we're putting safety first.
Let's go back to economic matters, obviously, because that's your brief. Now, we've heard from Chancellor Jeremy Hunt saying that he's basically ruled out cutting taxes before the end of the year, so we're not to expect anything in the autumn statement. We then have Michael Gove, your colleague, talking about how the government should shift the burden from income to wealth. Is he freelancing? Is he onto something there?
Well, Michael is one of our most respected and experienced cabinet ministers, but I would just point out that we have a very progressive tax system in this country. I think the top 5% of earners pay about 50% of the tax revenue, and this is in line with most G7 countries. In terms of broader taxation, obviously we want taxes to come down, but as I say, we stick to our principles that you've got to put sound money first. When debt is rising significantly on the back of a pandemic and energy crisis, we've got to pay that down. There's no point borrowing to cut taxes when we're paying significant amount of interest. Obviously, as Conservatives, we want to get taxes down. I would just point out that even when taxes have increased, such as the corporation tax rise, it's still the lowest in the G7, and we've put in place mitigations such as tax allowances so that the effective tax rate that businesses pay is still very competitive on the international stage.
Yet at the same time, that polling by Ashcroft, when the public is asked who they associate with low taxes, they don't say the Tories anymore, they say Labour.
Well, we accept that taxes are higher than we want them to be. We want taxes to come down, but let's be clear about things. They're only going to go one way under Labour. They have made a significant amount, multi-billions of pounds of commitments of spending. Where are they going to get that from? They're going to have to raise taxes if they enter Downing Street at the next
So you're comfortable having lost your low-tax Tory status?
I would argue that we are still low tax and internationally competitive, but we are always looking at ways of bringing it down. But we are the party of responsible, sustainable finances first. Well, you can trust us with your taxpayer money not to be paying too much debt interest at the expense of something else. Well,
you say about being internationally competitive. I, funnily enough, was travelling through Rome Airport yesterday, and I was able to cash in on the fact that, of course, now we're out of the EU, I can buy duty-free shopping at the airport. And I may or may not have purchased something for myself on my way back to the GB News studio. Now, of course, if you're shopping in London, you can't benefit from duty-free shopping, which is a disaster for businesses in London, isn't it?
Well, we keep all taxes under review, as you would expect, but in that particular case, the evidence that we've seen is that it has actually a minimal impact on sales in London. You just have to walk around London this summer to see how many tourists that we have. It is thriving. So we keep all taxes under review.
All right, Gareth Davies, thank you very much for joining me. Please stay tuned, because up next we'll have Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary. See you very soon.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. Hope you enjoyed your weekend. It is ending on a fairly fine note for many of us. A lot of clear intervals through the evening and overnight away from the far north of Scotland. That is going to remain a bit breezier and cloudier. Some mist and fog patches will form underneath those clear skies, particularly for eastern England, southeast England, but also Northern Ireland turning quite murky first thing on Monday morning. For most of us, though, it will be a fairly mild, warm start, temperatures around 14-15 degrees Celsius in a lot of our towns and cities. Once that mist and fog does eventually clear its way off, Monday promises to be a pretty glorious day for many of us. A good swathe of sunshine for the vast majority of the UK. It will be a bit breezy around the West Country, gusty along some coastlines here, and always cloud lingering across the very far north of Scotland. Drizzly outbreaks of rain for Shetland as well. But elsewhere in that sunshine, feeling very warm, widely into the mid-20s, if not the high 20s across southern England and Wales. High pressure sticks with us into the middle part of the week, but it reorientates itself, so we tap into a southerly airflow that allows us to feed in some even warmer conditions from continental Europe. So on the grand scheme of things, Tuesday looks like another pretty fine day for many of us. Again, still quite blustery across the southwest, some higher base cloud pushing in across Northern Ireland as well, turning the sunshine hazier, and cloud just still lingering across parts of Orkney, the Isle of Lewis. But still plenty of amounts of sunshine to be had, and temperatures peaking around Wednesday and Thursday over 30 degrees Celsius.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, nah, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now I'll be joined by Danny Kruger, the Tory MP who's leading a new Conservative movement in the party, in just a moment. But first of all, let's cross now to Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson, who will give us Labour's view on this concrete crisis. Ms Phillipson, I hope you can hear me. Lovely to speak to you. It's the first time you've come on the show, so I'm delighted to have you. I mean, what's your reaction to what's been happening in schools, the last-minute nature of these closures? I know that you have your own school-age children like me and that they attend state schools. Are you worried about them going into the classroom this week?
No, I'm pleased that children are returning to school, including my own children. It's really important that they get back to their learning. But, you know, I appreciate that lots of parents across the country will be concerned because, you know, sadly, many children are not going to be able to return to education or will be moved into porta cabins or alternative accommodation because of the risk that this kind of crumbly concrete is going to pose. It all feels very last minute. And what we're calling on the government to do is to publish a full list of all of the schools affected so that parents can be confident about where the problems are. And if they're not prepared to do that, we'll force a vote in Parliament this week to make it happen.
And are you worried that the government has been rather trying to cover up how many schools are affected? We see reports in the newspapers this morning that there's also hospitals affected. There's now new fears over asbestos. There's the suggestion perhaps that this concrete has been used in other public buildings that may again put public safety at risk.
I am concerned that we don't yet know the full extent of all of this. There are reports that engineers are being sent into schools to do further assessments around the condition. So I think it is important that we get to the bottom of all of this. But, you know, this comes back to sticking plasters, really. Of course, you know, it's right that the government put in place mitigations to keep children safe. But one of the first actions of an incoming Conservative government in 2010 was to cancel Labour's school rebuilding programme. And here we are, 13 years on, and the chickens have come home to roost.
I mean, at the same time, you might say that, to be fair, this has been a historic problem. I remember when I first started out in journalism covering these sorts of stories. They also happened under Blair's leadership. Historically, perhaps successive governments simply have not done enough to reinforce the school estate.
Well, the last Labour government had a major school rebuilding programme, and it was the Conservatives who cancelled that plan we had that would have meant that every single secondary school in England would have been rebuilt or significantly been refurbished by 2020. So if that had happened, we wouldn't be having this same conversation now about some of those secondary schools that are sadly not going to be reopening or reopening fully as planned this week. But alongside that, you know, many of the schools in question have a length of time that the schools were intended to be built for. They've long since passed that natural life, and I think it is frankly negligent that the government have time and again cut the funding for school rebuilding, but alongside that have just failed consistently to be upfront about the scale of the challenge we face. I've been raising this with ministers for months and months and months, and they've known for a very long time about the need for action. So I think this last-minute scrabble really should have been avoided. It's not fair for parents, and it's certainly not fair for school leaders who are trying to get everything back up and running at the start of the new term.
Although, according to the IFS, one particular Labour proposal, should you take power come the next general election, this proposal to scrap the tax breaks afforded to private schools could end up costing the taxpayer money. The IFS has concluded that it may push 40,000 private school pupils into state schools. You've already raised issues about classrooms being overcrowded, so I'd be interested to know how you'd solve that problem, but also that the policy could cost the taxpayer £300 million. Are you rethinking this policy? It sounds to some like the politics of envy, Ms Phillipson.
No, it's about making sure that we're investing in our state schools where the vast majority of children go to school. The Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies concluded that Labour's plans to end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, that would raise between £1.3 to £1.5 billion a year. I think that is a considerable sum of money. We would use that money to deliver more teachers into our classrooms, better mental health support for our children, and high and rising standards in all of our state schools. I see no good reason why private schools continue to enjoy these tax breaks. And I hope the Chancellor might at some point decide to act and end those tax breaks so that we can prioritise state education. That's what a Labour government would be doing right now.
How will you find classroom spaces for 40,000 new kids in state schools?
Well, the IFS recognised that overall net, the changes to tax breaks would raise 1.3 to 1.5 billion. So it'll be raising considerable sums of money. Actually, alongside that, we're seeing demographic shift that means there will be ample space for any children. But it's a lot of the private schools who scaremonger around some of this. I just don't accept that.
What do you mean,
They've been putting up their costs year on year beyond... Well, the private schools have been putting up their fees year on year beyond inflation. I think they've got the scope to cut a bit here and there.
What do you mean by...
And actually, this policy will raise money.
What do you mean by demographic shifts, which mean that you're going to have more spaces in schools? We've had the Labour Party banging on for the last 13 years about a lack of classroom space. So how are you going to accommodate 40,000 kids switching from private to state? You can't build schools that quickly, can you?
Well, sadly, in large parts of the country, schools are beginning to close because we're seeing fewer young people arriving at secondary school. There are fewer young people of secondary school age. But actually, the IFS was very clear that it endorsed what we had said around the revenue that could be raised. And it's achievable. We know we can do it. I'm confident we can do it. We will do it because we need to put that money into state education.
But what about parental choice? I mean, you do appreciate that not everybody that sends their children to a private school is driving into the car park in a Rolls Royce. What about the just about managing who have chosen private education over state and they're then going to be clobbered with school fees that are probably going to be 25% higher and therefore completely unaffordable? Does Labour not represent those sorts of constituents?
I'll never criticise individual parents for wanting to do what's right and best by their children. Of course, I think parental choice is incredibly important, but actually for the vast majority of parents, including middle-class parents, private schools are way beyond their reach. I mean, the average fee is in the region of £15,000 per year per child. That is beyond most people, and private schools have put up their fees way above inflation year on year. So actually, I think most parents would want a Secretary of State that's prioritising funding and resources and standards in our state schools. I mean, that's where 93% of children are. That's my priority.
David Blunkett, who I think you'll agree knows quite a lot about schools but also about Labour politics, has given an interview to the Sunday Telegraph today where he basically says that Labour would need a miracle to win the next general election. Has he got that wrong?
I agree, it's a tall order, not least coming off the back of such a big defeat in 2019. But I'm confident that under Keir Starmer, we're looking outwards to the country. We're setting out the change that a Labour government would deliver. We're not complacent about that. There's still a long time to go until the election, whenever it comes. But I tell you, that general election cannot come soon enough. People are crying out for change. And this government is just lingering on. And people are really struggling. So I think the British people should decide.
And equally, though, he doesn't seem to be too enthused by Starmer or indeed the cabinet to which you belong. He talks about the glory days of Robin Cook and Margaret Beckett and so-called knowns, and says that, unfortunately, the current shadow cabinet just isn't recognisable enough to the public. Is that a fair criticism?
I have the utmost respect for David, and I've spent quite a lot of time with him talking about how he transformed education in 1997 when he was Education Secretary. So I'll happily take advice and support from David on all of those issues. But of course, yes, absolutely, we've still got a job of work to do in communicating our message to the public and getting out there and showing people that we're on their side. But if you take me back to where we were in 2019 after that devastating defeat, you know, the worst that we'd ever experienced since the 30s, and said to me now that we would have turned the party around and we'd be looking outwards to the country, then I'm not sure I would have believed you. So we've made enormous progress. I completely accept that there is more to do in communicating it. That's why I'm here this morning speaking to you, telling you about the difference a Labour government would make. Breakfast clubs in our schools, cutting the cost of school uniform, more teachers in our classrooms. We've got a lot to say, and I really look forward to the chance to make that argument in a general election.
How widespread do you think Keir Starmer's reshuffle will be this week? And unkind Labour sources have sort of described John Healey as, quotes, too tame to take on Grant Shapps as Defence Secretary. Will the likes of Mr Healey keep his job? Will he be out? Who would you like to see back in the Cabinet? Shadow Cabinet.
You'll understand that these are all matters. Sure, you'll understand that these are all matters for Keir as leader of our party, so I'm not going to be getting into any speculation about names or anything of that kind. These are matters for Keir, and we're all of us, both those of us on the front bench and those of us on the back benches, we're focused on making sure that we're in a strong position going into the election so that we can deliver the change that people desperately want to see.
Couple more final questions for you, Ms Phillipson. I wondered what you made of Penny Mordaunt's suggestion that young people should do compulsory national service. I'm not convinced about that. I think I want young people to have opportunities to engage in volunteering, skills, taking part in their community. Lots of young people already do that, whether that's through the Duke of Edinburgh Award, through Scouts. There's a whole range of ways that young people contribute to our society. I've not been persuaded by that, and I'm not quite clear what the full plan she's setting out would involve. And very briefly, is Sadiq Khan's ULEZ going to cost you votes in London, as was the case with the Uxbridge by-election?
I accept the need to take action and make sure that we've got clean air. I think the challenge has been making sure that people are supported during this cost of living crisis, and that's why Sadiq Khan has rightly put in place additional measures around scrappage. But the government have said, you know, they've asked local authorities to put in place these kinds of plans, and now they've got the brass neck to complain about it.
Thank you very much, Bridget Phillipson, for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Now, I'm joined in the studio by Danny Kruger. He's the Tory MP for Devizes. He's the co-leader of the New Conservatives group, and he's author of a new book, Covenant, The New Politics of Home, Neighbourhood and Nation. Danny, thank you very much for joining me this morning. Now, I'm intrigued because obviously you're saying in this book what's wrong with Britain, but I'd like to know what kind of society would you like to create? What would you like to see change?
Thanks for that. Well, I mean, my view is we face a huge number of threats in the West generally and in the UK specifically, and they are long-term threats, largely driven by technology and the changes in our society and our economy. And we feel very precarious. I think that's driving a lot of the politics of the West at the moment, people feeling very nervous about all sorts of different threats, system threats, economic threats, cultural threats, ecological threats, military threats, of course, as well. So the question is, how strong is our state and how strong is our society? And what I argue for in my new book is that we need to think about the conditions in which people behave well towards each other. It's not right for the state to come in and try and fix every problem in retrospect after it's developed. We should be thinking about, not just as government, but as a society, how we nurture the virtues, the values, the behaviours, the habits, relationships that make us strong. And those are quite traditional institutions, in my view. They're families, they're neighbourhoods, and they're nations. And in my view, Brexit and the 2019 election that we won so convincingly was a call from the public, not just to take back control from Brussels, but for a reset in our politics and the way that we organise ourselves. And there was a demand for significant change. And of course, we delivered that with Brexit, and all credit to the government in 2019, 2020 for doing that. I think, given events since COVID, Ukraine, economic challenge, I think the public are now asking, where's the real change that we demanded last time round? And that's what the group of new Conservative MPs, we call ourselves that because we were all elected since the Brexit referendum, and we stand for this realignment in our politics, a reorientation of government back towards the values and the interests of the British people, away from the metropolitan concerns of the London establishment. What we're calling for is an attempt by what we think the government should be doing is reassembling that coalition of voters who put us into power in 2019, which include places like I represent in Wiltshire, the traditional base of the Tory party, but also these small C Conservative voters who used to vote Labour, voted for us last time because they want change. And I don't think we can yet say, I think we've still got time to do it, but I think the public is still crying out for the change that they demanded last time round.
Do you think the Conservatives have sort of lost touch with family values and family-orientated policies?
Well, my view is that family is the foundation of a healthy society. I'm pretty traditional about that. I don't think that means that government should be prescriptive and moralistic about how people should live their lives. That's the antithesis of what we want. We want people to take responsibility for themselves, not be bossed around by government. But I do think government should be incentivising the behaviour that most people want to follow themselves. They want to get married, stay married, bring their kids up well, be able to look after their elderly parents. These are all the natural impulses of society, and yet, because government is so determined not to moralise, not to try and influence people, or rather in fact to respond to the choices that people are making, we have a system in which we incentivise family breakup. We give more money to families who put their elderly parents into a residential home rather than keep them at home with themselves. We make it easier to break up. We pay people to send or young people to go far away to university rather than stay close to home. We are essentially incentivising the dissolution of the family, not because we're trying to do that, it's just the well-meaning government policy is having, I think, a negative effect on family life.
But then you talk about the government not moralising, and at the same time, you say, and I quote, marriage is the safest and best place for sex. So what are you saying, that people shouldn't have sex before marriage?
I don't think government should be moralising on that topic. I'm talking generally about what the culture should say, and my point in that section of the book is to say I think we should be encouraging our children to think about monogamy, think about the importance of marriage, of staying faithful. And I do worry about the sort of sexual disarray that young people are in at the moment, and I don't think it's a happy scene that
when
we've
you
got
say
at the
sexual
moment.
disarray, what do you mean with confusion over gender?
Well, that's a reflection of our failure to essentially tell our young people, tell our children how they're supposed to live as they grow up and how they're supposed to relate to the opposite sex. And I think we're in a state of where we're reaping the whirlwind of a cultural revolution that took place when we were younger in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when intellectuals basically told everyone it doesn't matter how you live and it's all down to you, and what you care for and wish for matters more than the inherited understandings of our society. And you matter more than your relationships. And I think that's the great mistake we've made in our lifetimes.
I know, but then you think about your generation, and what your generation was told is that you could be an individual, that you go out there and you didn't need to be close to the family home, and you didn't need to necessarily follow in your father's footsteps and carry on his family business or whatever, that you could go out. I mean, are you saying that you feel individualism has turned into narcissism in some way?
Yes, I do, Camilla. Well put, thank you, because I don't want to say that we should go back to a very static society where, yes, you have to follow your parents' trade, you have to live close to the home, you have to be in an arranged marriage, all the things that we've rightly done away with. We need freedom, and that's the great British story, by the way, is we do have a tradition in which people travel for work, they make their own futures. We have a tradition of independence and self-reliance. That's really important. But actually, the choice that most of us want to make in life, yes, we might want to go away to study or to work, but really we want to be attached to the place that we think of as home.
If we can afford to be.
If we can afford to be. And again, it's part of the incentives that our culture and our economy makes. It's very, very difficult to keep your roots. So we need to create a society and an economy in which it's easier to do the things that most people want to do, which includes fulfilling the obligations they have to their family.
I mean, I completely understand exactly where you're coming from. Some people might think it's a bit backward-looking, it's a bit harking back to sort of the days of the 1950s.
I really want to challenge that, Camilla. May I challenge that?
Well, I'm
yes.
saying, particularly from a female perspective, you know, if you're a single mum bringing up 2 kids on a council estate in East London and you're hearing a Tory MP sort of talking about a return to family values, you're going to feel quite judged, and you're going to think, well, what's going to incentivise me to vote for this party?
Right, so thank you for saying that. I mean, so I've done a lot of work, in fact, in London, in housing estates. I worked a lot with prisoners and ex-prisoners, with young families in trouble. I'm very familiar with the challenges that families in those circumstances face. We really need to support those families. We really need to make it easier for people to bring up their kids well. Part of that, I do think, is about helping couples to stay together through the tax and the benefit system, which at the moment works in the opposite direction. But yeah, we are not in the business of judging or prescribing how families should operate. But your point about turning back the clock, I'm really conscious of that being an accusation against me, and I really worry about it because nobody wants to go backwards. I certainly don't. And I think the 1950s model that you describe, where you basically had to be married, and if you were a woman, you stayed at home bringing the kids up, is totally wrong. It's, in fact, historically anomalous. You know, that's not the traditional way of doing things. Women have always had an economic role until that little weird moment post-war when there was this idea of domesticity. So actually, I think we need a society in which men and women can fulfil the natural instincts they have to look after their families, which applies to men too, of course, to play a role in their communities and to have a role in the economy. So actually, it might sound old-fashioned, and in a sense it is, because I think what we want is an opportunity to work close to home, to fulfil those different responsibilities, not beyond this idea of you know, having to go far away from home, work long hours, never see your family. That isn't the model that anybody wants, men or women. So I think actually, and what I think is that modernity, technology in particular, the internet, is making a more traditional way of life more possible, but in a more equal way. So, you know, in Devizes in Wiltshire, where I represent, you know, it is now possible to have a really successful, thriving career without having to travel long distances all the time, and to play a part in your community and see your family for a decent amount of time each week.
I mean, the kind of adverse view to that is that we're constantly attached to the office because of these, and even on holidays we have to still work, and actually family time becomes eroded. I think also some of this talk perhaps alienates working women who might feel that they're being judged by family-orientated politicians who seem to be suggesting that the denigration of the family unit might might be down to women working. You know, your mother, Prue Leith, is a very famous working woman, and I would imagine a bit of a matriarch in the Kruger family.
So there you go. So my mum represents, I think, a great model of how to do it, and she was very present as a child. I mean, when I was a child, in a sense, she had the opportunity to, because she was an entrepreneur, she could manage her own time. But that's the kind of life we want. My wife works in prisons, still working for our charity. She's a active mum, and she works in the community, helps with our kids' school as well, and does her job in the prisons. These things are possible, you know, for many people. They need to be possible for everybody. And I would challenge the idea that this is somehow anti-women. Most women want to have the kind of life I think I'm describing, as dads do. There's no real difference. We all want the same kind of life, which is one where we're fulfilled in our careers or our jobs, and we have the opportunity to see our family and to play a role in our neighbourhood. That's what I think government policy should be about, rather than always striving to drive up GDP figures by getting more people to work longer hours. Yes, we need economic success and prosperity. We need to be driving the engine of growth. We need to get more people back into the office as well, actually. But the thing that really matters to most people, you and me, is our families and our communities. And even for those of us who live in sort of non-traditional families, that same applies. You want to feel connected and you want to belong.
But then isn't Rishi Sunak the sort of ultimate family man? And yet at the same time, politicians like you don't seem to be in favour of him and the way that he's running the country.
So
you know, you
there's
don't think there's a suggestion really among your new Conservative group that he simply isn't Thatcherite and right enough to be acceptable to your caucus of...
No, so actually, well, on family policy, on social policy, I think Rishi is absolutely in the right place. He's very concerned about all of the cultural questions that we rightly worry about at the moment. He's concerned about the kind of education his children are receiving. And he really believes in strong families. He also believes in growth and in prosperity, as we do.
Covenant, the new politics of home, neighbourhood and nation. It's out already, is it?
It's out on Saturday, I think.
It's out on Saturday.
You can pre-order. I think you get a discount if you order now.
Good man. And also at all good bookshops, as they say.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities.
especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this Sunday morning. Now, Friday marks, would you believe, the first anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's death. And I'm joined now by Elsa Anderson, former press secretary to Her late Majesty. Elsa, lovely to see you this morning. I can't believe it's been a year.
I can't. It's gone slowly, and yet it's raced past. I cannot believe it. If you think this time last year, when obviously we saw those images of the Queen looking frail, and then, of course, then it happened.
No, although that last image of her working 2 days before she passed away, a remarkable woman, in a way, I think the transition has actually been much smoother than I had anticipated. Whenever I've been doing this job, and I've been doing it for quite a long time with regard to reporting on the royals, I've always thought that the nation would have some kind of collective nervous breakdown when the Queen died. And actually, to be fair to the King and Queen Camilla, I think it's gone all right the last 12 months, notwithstanding some Harry issues, which we'll get onto. But what's your analysis, Elsa?
I completely agree. I think it's sort of keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
It's been a slow transition. I thought the King's state visit to Germany was absolutely faultless.
Yes.
How he spoke in German, his sense of humour, his warmth, his great intellect came through. So I really do think it's a slow transition, but it's been faultless.
And Queen Camilla, I mean, in a way, did she make a rod for her own back with this kind of insistence that we drop the consort and call her the Queen? Not everyone is comfortable with that term when applied to Camilla.
I think it's the right decision. She is the Queen. She is, and she is his consort. And I think people don't talk about it anymore. Maybe at the beginning when it was announced, but now people are just taking it as the norm. She is the Queen.
And what was interesting about the coronation, I thought, is how much she put her own stamp on that ceremony.
Yeah.
I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who I know you also used to work for back in the day, crowning them both alongside each other, them both appearing on the balcony. He's with his family, she's with hers. She insisted that her side of the family, her sister and her nieces and nephews, were present for that moment. And we know that not many non-royals ever appear on the balcony. What's the last example? I suppose Winston Churchill. So that was significant too. Do we think that the Queen is really ruling the roost, or is the King very much in command?
I wouldn't say that. I think she is an absolutely crucial support role for him. And I think the balcony and the combined families is modern Britain. You know, what family do you not know? You know, I'm one of them.
Blended families.
Blended, absolutely. So they are actually representing what modern Britain is today.
But is it problematic for them that they're in their 70s? They've got this huge workload. There's been a few reports sort of saying, oh, God, they haven't found it as easy. I mean, there's talk that the Commonwealth heads of government, I think, is going to be in Samoa or somewhere miles and miles away. It's not like when the Queen took the throne at 25 and could jet around the world for months on end. I mean, these people are working well beyond retirement age. And also, does that pose a problem for the brand? Because they kind of seem like the sandwich generation between the Queen on the throne for all that time and then, of course, the Prince and Princess of Wales and their youth and vitality, the other side of the coin.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think the programme can be paced to represent their reflective ages. The King is known for having extreme high energy levels. You know, he's a workaholic. So I don't think just because he's in his 70s that actually that will affect his pace at all. I think they'll crack on.
But do you worry about the slimmed down nature of things? I mean, Princess Anne expressed some concern that they couldn't slim down any further. I think when the King talked about slimming down the monarchy from a value for money perspective, he wasn't anticipating the absence of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and indeed the absence of his own brother, the Duke of York, from public life. And you look at the balcony now and you think, oh my goodness, it's a bit thin on the ground. And you've got the likes of the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, formerly Sophie and Edward Wessex, kind of bringing up the rear, doing jobs. But, you know, it does look a little bit fractured, perhaps, because of Harry and Meghan's absence.
I don't know. I think you could maybe argue that a slimmed-down monarchy is actually more fitting for the 21st century.
Yes.
You know, do you need as many working royals out there with the perception that it's taxpayer money that's funding them? So actually, I think the king is doing the right thing, slimming it down, concentrating on those charities and patronages, which he should do, and going forward in that direction.
Can we have your PR analysis of the state of things with regard to Harry and Meghan? We've gone from the Netflix documentary to Spare, to them being lampooned on South Park and being described as grifters. And we've seen some imagery even today of them at this Beyoncé concert, and Meghan looks very happy. Harry doesn't necessarily, but it could have been just a bad camera angle. I mean, what's your analysis of their popularity versus that of the royals at the moment and where we are with this?
Well, like any good PR professional, I'd advise myself not to get down that rabbit hole.
No, Elsa, here's the rabbit hole. Imagine yourself as Alice in Wonderland. But seriously, just in terms of OK, let's put it this way. Perhaps we could argue that the royal family have fared extraordinarily well.
Mm-hmm.
If you think back to Oprah and some of the claims that were made, that actually their popularity appears to be on the rise while Harry and Meghan's has nosedived.
I think, you know, I haven't got a crystal ball. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? He's obviously working very hard on his charities, on the Invictus Games, which has been, you know, a celebrated success.
Yeah.
You know, I'm the daughter of a military officer. I know what it's like when you're injured in the military and you feel you don't get the support. And I think that is a real, you know, testimony to his passion for the armed forces. He does this year after year after year.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Do the royals have to reconcile with them, do you think, or...?
Well, it's a family. You know, families have disputes. I can't think of one family that doesn't have an up and down.
Yeah, but although unlike the rest of us, they're not plastered across the front
Totally.
pages.
And it's difficult. And obviously, you know, according to the media, there's a lack of trust between family members now.
Yeah.
But I'm a firm believer in reconciliation.
Thank you very much indeed for your expertise this morning. I'm back next week at 9:30. Up next, it's Michael Portillo. But first, here's some more weather.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Vaughtry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. Hope you enjoyed your weekend. It is ending on a fairly fine note for many of us. A lot of clear intervals through the evening and overnight away from the far north of Scotland. That is going to remain a bit breezier and cloudier. Some mist and fog patches will form underneath those clear skies, particularly for eastern England, southeast England, but also Northern Ireland turning quite murky first thing on Monday morning. For most of us, though, it will be a fairly mild, warm start. Temperatures around 14, 15 degrees Celsius in a lot of our towns and cities. Once that mist and fog does eventually clear its way off, Monday promises to be a pretty glorious day for many of us. A good swathe of sunshine for the vast majority of the UK. It will be a bit breezy around the West Country, gusty along some coastlines here, and always cloud lingering across the very far north of Scotland. Drizzly outbreaks of rain for Shetland as well. But elsewhere in that sunshine, feeling very warm, widely into the mid-20s, if not the high 20s across southern England and Wales. High pressure sticks with us into the middle part of the week, but it reorientates itself, so we tap into a southerly airflow that allows us to feed in some even warmer conditions from continental Europe. So on the grand scheme of things, Tuesday looks like another pretty fine day for many of us. Again, still quite blustery across the southwest, some higher base cloud pushing in across Northern Ireland as well, turning the sunshine hazier, and cloud just still lingering across parts of Orkney, the Isle of Lewis. But still plenty of mats of sunshine to be had, and temperatures peaking around Wednesday and Thursday over 30 degrees Celsius.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you